This week we're going to continue working on this monochromatic skull painting that we started last week. No art history in this video. This one's going to be all about the techniques that I used to paint this skull. And so here's a high-res photo of my completed painting, and I'll have this placed on the left side of the screen as we paint. That way you can see what we're working towards. As I'm working, one thing that I'm always thinking about is the illusion that goes on in painting. And that illusion is about creating an image that looks like it has 3 dimensions, that it has depth, all on a 2-dimensional surface like the canvas that I'm working on here. And it starts first with the drawing so that the proportions are accurate using linear, 2-point, 3-point perspective. But in this video, I'm just going to be talking about the values, meaning how the lights and darks can sculpt the painting. So the first thing that I'm going to do here is start working on the lower part of the maxilla, just to the left of the zygomatic bone. What I'm doing here is using some freehand shields to get some separation between the bone, between the maxilla, and that really dark black background. I want the edges to be very sharp, so some sort of masking tool is going to help me out. For this one, I just decided to use freehand shields. The right side has a bit of texture, so I'll use a ripped piece of paper. That way the edge of the paper just gets transferred over to the canvas. And then I'll work on that transition point. A lot of this is going to be in shadow, so I will be using some shields, some ripped pieces of paper, and of course some very, very subtle erasing just to pull out some highlights. And then once I have the impression of this painted in, I'm going to just glaze some black paint right over the top of it, a thin amount. This is just going to push everything away. And that black background, those really dark values, is one of the keys to creating that illusion of depth. This black paint makes it look like this area that I'm circling right here is farther away from us or angled away from the light source. And then the maxilla bone over to the left of it, which we didn't even paint in yet, is brighter, so it looks like it's closer to us or angled toward the light source. Besides the perspective of the drawing, which is obviously very important, those values that we're painting in now is the key to creating the illusion that we're going for. And just a reminder, I'm only using one color here. I'm controlling all of my values by how much paint is applied to that canvas. So let's continue with that same technique by painting in the teeth. The first thing that I want to do is start painting in the background. I'll use a shield for those sharper edges. That's going to give some separation between the teeth and the background. And then for some of the edges that are a bit softer, I'm going to paint them in freehand just because the background is a solid color. So this black paint here, I'm using directly from the bottle, and you can see that I'm able to get some very sharp lines just because I'm holding the airbrush right off the surface. The tip of that airbrush needle is just a few millimeters back, and you can see that I'm just working slowly around each tooth. I painted in the edges first, which kind of looks like an outline, but then I'll just fill in the center with that black paint. And so that outline just becomes a transition point from the tooth to the black background. I'll continue along down to the right using the exact same techniques, and I'm not going to get carried away here painting in the entire background. There's a lot of detail in here. There's a ton of things going on, so in order for me not to get overwhelmed so I don't start to rush, I'm just doing a smaller section at a time. So I'll just continue along painting in that background, filling in those very dark values. Once I get some of those in, just a smaller section here, I'll start working on some of the texture. This section that I'm circling is going to have a few parts raised up catching some light, but most of it is going to be in shadow. As I paint in the surrounding area, I leave paint out of the areas that I want to be brighter, and then I just erase into those sections using both the stick eraser and the electric eraser. And if anything gets too bright with that erasing, no big deal, just a quick glaze of black paint right over the top. As I move along to the right, you'll notice that there's 2 planes here which are angled toward the light source. As I painted in the dark surrounding values, I left these 2 planes blank, but since they weren't fully masked off, there's still going to be overspray on top of them, so there's going to be some paint in here. That means I can go right over to my electric eraser and start adding texture in here. The edges here are going to be a little bit softer, so I could use a stick eraser and just kind of blend them out into the black background. And then I'll use the airbrush freehand, just kind of spray in a few dots here just along those edges to blend it into that background. As I continue to work my way around the teeth here, I'm just constantly thinking about where that light source is. I know that it's over to the right, so the light source is shining right to left, meaning any of the planes along the right side are going to be illuminated. The reference photo that I'm working from is always going to be my guide, but like I said in last week's video, in some parts of this I'm slightly exaggerating things, and in order to do that I need to know where the light source or light sources are coming from. If you look at the 2 teeth that I just painted in, you can easily see that illusion come together. Like this part of the tooth right here, it looks like a plane angled toward the light source. And then to the left of it, it looks like the tooth is in shadow rolling away from that light source. One way that I've always thought about it is just thinking about using those lights and darks to sculpt the painting. From here, what I'm going to do is just add a few more shadows to the teeth along to the right and just a bit of that subtle texture that we see in there. And then I'll come back to this part of the painting later on, because now what I want to do is paint in the left side these teeth that are in this really dramatic lighting. Just like the right side, I'll paint in the black background first. This way we get some separation between the teeth and the background. And you'll see me using some shields here, some ripped paper, and some freehand. Before I paint in the teeth on the left side, I want you to take a look at what this part of the painting looks like by itself. So here's a cropped section of my painting, and if you look at it like this, it just looks like a bunch of abstract shapes and abstract values. It honestly doesn't look like anything recognizable, and it certainly doesn't look like the teeth of a skull. Now, if I put the crop section on the left side of the screen and my completed painting on the right, you're going to see that that very abstract shape is suddenly recognizable. The reason that I'm showing you this is because when you're working in representational painting like what I'm doing here, it's so important to focus on what you see rather than what you think it's supposed to look like. So focus your attention on those values, the lights and the darks, the planes, the shapes, and the proportions. As you continue painting more and more, you'll start to see that there's a lot of very small abstractions in all representational painting. As I work my way down here, I'm just going from one tooth to the next. There are some subtle shadows on each one of the teeth, so I will paint those in freehand with the airbrush. And then for any of those bright highlights, I will just pull them out with that electric eraser. A piece of paper here to paint in that straight edge, and then for these subtle shadows in here, I'm just going to do this freehand. I'm switching off between the two techniques here because it's nice to have some variety in the edges. I don't want them all to be razor sharp because sometimes it just kind of looks like it's stenciled. So painting in some freehand edges just helps kind of balance it out, makes it look a bit more natural. I'll continue working my way around each one of these teeth, adding in those subtle shadows. Once I have that done, I could switch right over to that eraser and start pulling out the bright highlights. For this molar at the bottom, I'm just going to paint around it. If I need to brighten it up later, I can always do that with the eraser, but you could just see here, just filling in the surrounding area makes this area look bright. And just remember that in drawing or painting, if you want something to look bright, you need to have dark values surrounding it. As I work my way down the right side here, I'm following that same procedure by painting in the background first, meaning that I'm painting in between each one of these teeth. You'll see me using a few shields here and some freehand techniques. Again, just kind of balancing the two, mixing it up. There's really not that much texture on each one of these teeth because the light source is directly hitting it, kind of washing out any of the subtle texture. So what I'll do is use a softer eraser so it doesn't pull out too much texture and erase into each one of the highlights on each tooth. And so that's where I'm going to wrap this one up. I do hope that this little demo was helpful to some of you guys out there. Just remember to focus on what you see, pay attention to those values, those darks and those lights. And most importantly, make sure you enjoy that time spent drawing or painting. It's an important thing to do. It's a good thing to do. So keep with it. Keep going. I'd like to welcome the newest members this week, Krister and Michael. Thank you guys so much for joining and welcome. I'd also like to welcome back Thaga, Taper Game for that very generous tier 3, and Yao. I'd also like to thank the very generous support of the long-term members, including Mike C, PSI Burr, Ari, Christine, Ryland, Robert, Kevin, Pascal, Jeff, Alex, Serge, Steve D, Sebastian, Thomas, Renee, Tyrell, and Manny, Jimbo, Cater, Ted, Chiwa, and Radic. I'll make sure to thank the rest of you guys in the members video, which will be up in a week. And I will see you guys back here next Friday.